Neil, there you are. Long
Wow,
time no
it's been
see.
so long.
Oh my God,
Oh
it
my
must be
God.
at least 10 years.
At least, yes.
At least.
Since that restaurant that we met at.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Oh my gosh.
So have you ever been here before?
I haven't, and it's, I have not been here at all, and I understand it's been up for quite a while.
Wow, it looks great.
Oh, it's neat. My name is Neil Leighton, and I was the director of the Oral History Project at the University of Michigan, Flint. And we conducted that over about a decade and a half, about 150 interviews of sit-downers, old-timers in Flint, even policemen. And we created this archive, and it's housed at the U of M Flint. And in 1987, which was the 50th anniversary of the sit-down strike, Sean Nethercutt came along and was a faculty member in the theater department, and she created a play called 3787 with the students, which was quite unusual, and she will tell us about it.
I was hired really in a sort of surprising turn of events to come to Flint in 1986. And the whole experience was a life-changing experience for me, but also for the people that we worked with. Because before I came here, I had never heard of the sit-downers, much less the sit-down strike. But when I got here, it really changed my view about how culture takes place, how politics takes place, and how people at the most rudimentary and difficult levels of society can really transform the entire society. What we began doing is taking those many, many oral histories and then using them to inspire playwriting. What was so interesting about the 3787 project was who we were working with. We were mostly working with the children and the grandchildren of sit-downers, but the shocking truth of it is that most of them knew nothing about it. So here they were, having the legacy of one of the most important struggles in the U.S. history, and them not knowing how much their life had been transformed by it. But as we began to dig into this, people began to understand and realize how important their family history was, how important their city was. And that led us to really growing the project from just being a traditional kind of a play to being a whole exercise in community memory. And so we started taking those oral histories and turning them into short little plays, and then taking those short little plays into schools, into union halls, into senior centers, into picket lines, into parades, all kinds of activities, so that the entire community began to be involved in remembering not only the importance of the sit-down strike, but what it did for the nation and how important, how central Flint was to the transformation of the entire employment structure of the nation.
The 37 strike is very important because, like a lot of strikes before it, and those right up to the present day, it's not just about wages, working conditions. Deep down, it's about respect and dignity. And that's what it's always been for those strikes long before 37. But the 37 strike puts it into focus nationally. And so what's critical about that is the 37 strike, as one writer said, may have been the most important strike in the history of American labor because it was about industrial unionism and a large corporation having to submit to it. So the 37 strike grows out of a tactic which really is perfected in Eastern Europe, in Hungary and places like that, brought to the United States by left-wing groups. And it starts even before the Flint sit-down. There's plants around the country where people sit down. But in Flint, it really took off. And it becomes a very big deal. And it just paralyzes General Motors at a point in time in 37 when the Depression is starting to ease up a little bit and production is starting to take off again. And without going through the whole litany of it, the strike really comes to a crucible, to a head in Plant 9, which made engines for the low-cost Chevrolets, okay? And what's critical about that is that by the time you get to Plant 9, there are a lot of people energized, and there are things that are crossing lines of division in American society. And so black workers, which in Flint were sanitation workers in the plants, outside of the plants, or they worked in the foundry in Buick, which was just a miserable job. They're brought in very slow, very minimal, but they become important. And one of the most important is a fellow named Henry Clark. And he works in the Buick foundry. And Henry Clark is placed in contact with Bob Travis, who's the leader of the strike. And Travis has had a lot of experience outside of Flint. And he contacts Henry Clark in a meeting, and they decide to organize among the foundry workers in Buick, Eastern Europeans, black workers, and begin to have some contacts with some of the assembly people in Buick up above, totally unknown to management. When the strike is over and it's necessary for workers to sign up, GM management is so confident that Buick will never sign. They signed overwhelmingly. And a lot of that work is the result of Henry Clark organizing in the foundry and with Bob Travis. So that becomes a critical point of the strike. This picture is the end of the strike, and it has a little story all its own, kind of very important. As you can see, the fellow with what looks like a diploma in his hand is Bob Travis, and he was the leader of the strike. And the gentleman with the flag in his hand is a man named Roscoe Van Zandt. Now, this was inside Plant 9, and during the strike, the fellows were sitting around eating their lunch, and Roscoe was a sanitation worker because black workers were at the lowest level working within the plant. And so Roscoe was sitting off to the side eating his sandwich, and the guys reached out to him and said, come on over here. And so he did, and they got to talking and so on, which was kind of unusual in those days in Flint. And long story short, Roscoe, at the end, the guys said, here, Roscoe, since you've been through all of this with us, you carry the flag. And so when they marched out of the plant, which was the official end of the strike, to meet Bob Travis, Roscoe was carrying the flag. Well, it's a little symbolic. I don't want to make too much of it, but there were little events like that throughout the sit-down and right up to the present day, which chip away at one of those big divisions in our society, which is race.
It's amazing.
Great job.
And this is astonishing too. Of course, I remember the photos. These are famous photos.
Right.
You know.
Right.
And look here.
And this was the knocking out of the windows at Plant 9.
Because they were gassing them.
Right.
Because they were gassing them. See, and one of the things that was really stunning is because there was a lot of young women who were participating in the project, and they have often thought that what was in the plant was not for them, but this was a way to really, for women, in the young women who were in the program, to remember and think about how central the role of women were in the sit-down strike. Because without the role of the women feeding and organizing and managing the outside of the plant, the work inside of the plant never would have been successful.
And the women played a critical role in front of the plant as well, because they formed a barricade, they locked arms, and the cops came after them, and of course you see the one woman being dragged away, so they faced quite a bit of physical punishment. They put their lives on the line, and that was all outside of Plant 9, which was very critical, and it was Plant 9 which really signaled the end of the strike. The strike ended 2 days later.
One of the things that was really important was for the young women to realize that the outside organizing was as critical as the inside organizing. Right. And that was absolutely the center role of the women who were outside and doing the community work, because no strike lives without the community supporting it. Right. And so without their support, it wouldn't have been successful.
And the emergency brigade played a key role as well, not only in forming a barricade outside of Plant 9 and taking a lot of physical punishment, but they also were in cars picking up people and taking them back and forth from one plant to another, and even outside of town. So they were bringing women into Flint to support the strike. So it was very critical. The role was just, you can't say how important it was. I mean, it was just over the top. Okay?
And I think also that, like, if you look at this right here, of course, this is maybe more of a, the traditional way of the role of the women to provide the food and the clothing, which of course was critical, but because they're in there for weeks upon weeks, and so food has to come in because they're shutting off shutting off the heat, they're putting gas in. So without the women coming in, not only providing the food but breaking the windows so that the people can breathe in there, you really don't see this strike being successful without women maintaining the life support of it.
Right. And along with the food, the women not only brought food into the plant, but prepared it, and surprisingly enough, a chef from a local hotel in Flint dedicated his services to the strike, and he ran the kitchen. So it was all the way around. There were people volunteering and so on, and like this woman and the young boy, they even got their kids into the act, which was very important.
Which was why it was really so surprising that it only took a generation or two for the young people who were being raised in Flint to not know about this.
Oh.
And this was why this project was so important, was you had kids whose parents and grandparents had been there on the front line, but that story got disrupted, and it got disrupted for very obvious reasons during the 50s, so that people began to feel a little embarrassed about the fact that this was radical transformation and radical action in this community. But reviving that view and learning that view, in my case, it changed not only my life, it changed a lot of lives associated with that play. I'm still in contact with a lot of the young people from that particular project, and everyone, to a person, thinks that changed their view of how they operated in society. Almost all of them have taken on some form of activism. And I don't think that they would have said that had there not been that project. So good on you for starting it.
Well, you brought up a key point, and the key point is how the information and the knowledge of the strike was suppressed. And that's often not referred to. And that basically can be credited to the McCarthy program, which took a small number of people from Flint and sent them what we would call subpoenas today to come and testify. They didn't. But they scared them in doing that. And when we interviewed old sit-downers, they kind of told us, this was in the 1970s and early 80s, and they would tell us, well, I never told the kids about it because I didn't want them to end up in front of a McCarthy-like hearing, and so we just shut up about it. And that was very important for, cutting that kind of transmission of the history from 37 to 87, to use that as a benchmark. And that was very critical. And of course, there were a lot of wealthy folks and corporations and so on doing their bit to stop that historical flow. So what we did with the project, and you did with the play, and energizing these kids and so on, was very critical. As the union guys would say, carrying it on.
Well, the other thing that was really important about 87, and it's really important to remember where Flint was in 1987, is that you have to remember that was the year that 40,000 people were laid off in Flint, and there was unemployment lines stretching around the block. Industrial America was getting unmade right before our eyes. And so it was really important to remember at that moment that people could have a voice and a choice. And so that's part of the reason why 87 was built into that, because we were seeing the end of a kind of social structure that allowed people to have a dignified employment life. That was being undone right before our very eyes. And I remember, coming to Flint, not knowing anything about Flint, and then seeing how a very small number of people can choose to undo the lives of very many people. And it was a complete and total shock.
Vaseline, the pink shop blue. up out of your nose, but you can't blow it out of your ears. You got the blues. Wait a second, Jake.
Wasn't home there.
I know, man.
Yeah, I know. Making card bodies.
Only making a dime.
His body broke down.
He never reached 59.
Yeah.
Oh, that's blues. That man had blues, yeah.
Yes,
Well, I know
he
about the
did.
blues now.
They said he worked hard for the money.
Gave him a 50-50 funeral, honey. No, that's the blues. If you don't kiss my ass,